U.S. Monetary History, Chapter 5. The Intolerable Acts of King George and the Sons of Liberty. When we last left the colonies, they had just successfully financed the French and Indian War without the use of inflationary monetary policies. As shown by the prior chapter, not all fiat paper money was a failure, such as the Pennsylvania colonial script. We will explore how the colonies lost their freedom to print interest-free paper money and the acts that would threaten to dry the colonies of their last remaining medium of exchange, silver specie. The refusal of King George to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system, which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators, was probably the prime cause of the revolution. Benjamin Franklin. The British government bore much of the fiscal burden during the French and Indian War, which was known to the rest of the world as the 7 Years' War. Most of the fighting did not take place in the Americas, but across the globe, as it was considered to be the first true world war. The fighting would leave the British with £150 million of debt. The interest payments alone sucked up half of the national budget. King George would look to the colonies as an untapped revenue source. The colonies had been forced by the English Parliament to return to specie and retire all paper notes with the Currency Act of 1764. In colonies like Pennsylvania, where paper money had not been abused, there was protest. The paper money had not stalled trade and was highly praised by Benjamin Franklin in a pamphlet, A Modest Inquiry to the Nature and Necessity of Paper Money. The difference between the success with the paper money was usually based on the government's ability to use it sparingly and not use it as a means to inflate their way out of debts. This act required the colonies to retire the colonial paper script and made it no longer legal tender for public debts, meaning it could no longer serve as a taxable currency. This was largely in an effort to move the colonies to a system that could be taxed for silver specie. The reason was to be able to pay the debts to the central bank in London, the Bank of England, that had loaned the British government specie, hard money, usually in the form of silver, and would be required to pay some of its debts in kind, meaning that the British government needed to import more specie in the form of taxes from the colonies. Banning the use of colonial paper money was the first step to extracting the specie. England was broke and had taken large amounts of debt to sustain the fighting throughout the 7 Years' War. The colonies had been under the protection of the British military and were able to use emergency fiat paper issues redeemed through taxes shortly thereafter to finance their militias for defense. Britain had long left the Americas well enough alone, and the colonies enjoyed unprecedented freedoms for the time period. This is largely due to the way that the colonies had been settled. Unlike the Spanish operations in South America that were funded and overseen by the government, the British colonies had been settled by those who were willing to risk their own lives and capital without the direct supervision of the British government. Of course, there were exceptions, like the early settlements of Jamestown. This freedom led the colonies to have a distaste for the new controls over their economies that took the form of new taxes. These taxes and acts would include the Proclamation of 1763, that barred settlers from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. This took back land that had been given to settlers for their assistance during the French and Indian War. This was also seen by the colonies as limiting future generations' ability to expand and obtain prosperity. Many of the colonists, to include George Washington, ignored and settled or purchased land west of the Appalachians. The Sugar Act of 1764. This act reduced the price of the original tax, but it was still angering the colonists, as Parliament intended to enforce the laws unlike prior. Smuggling had been commonplace, and people could easily avoid paying taxes on goods throughout most of the colonial history. Now they had to try harder, and smuggling became even more risky and profitable. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed printed materials including legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, and many other forms of paper used throughout the colonies. These taxes were required to be paid in British sterling and not in colonial paper money, and was supposed to raise £100,000 annually. This is when the colonies' protests began to escalate. They would hold protests, and the Sons of Liberty would create and organize non-import agreements with merchants, essentially a boycott of British goods. The colonists even went so far as to intimidate the tax collectors with violence. This could go as far as tarring and feathering. The British government would act with unusual restraint throughout all of these demonstrations, allowing the local governments to function as normal. None of the protesters or organizers were arrested or kept from holding public office. No papers or printing presses were barred or seized, and radical groups like the Sons of Liberty were allowed to operate unimpeded. The British tyranny during this time was sparse and barely the things that would incite revolution. Looking back at this time, it is easy to think that all of these acts created a clear line of revolution, but during the time, it was far from so. Many still saw themselves as part of England and simply wanted the right to govern themselves, and the pattern would emerge. After the passing of a new act, there would be protests, heated arguments, tar and feathering, intimidation of tax collectors, would return to a relatively calm state once again, with the tension rising again with the next act, to return to relatively normal levels once again shortly thereafter. Each act caused only slightly more pain than the last, and had a relatively short adjustment period. After the Stamp Act, this would begin to change. All tax collectors of the Stamp Act had resigned from their post for fear of their lives. There was little to no revenue gained from this, and Parliament repealed it in 1766. The day after, they would pass the Declaratory Act, would assert Parliament's control over all matters concerning the colonies, stating that the Parliament had authority to make laws in the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Following this, they would pass the Townshend Act of 1767. This would tax glass, paint, tea, paper, and other imports to the colonies. Once again, this would be met with even higher levels of resistance in the colonies. The British government was growing tired of the resistance to taxes and was still in desperate need of additional tax revenue. They began to crack down on smuggling and began to move troops from the frontiers to the coastlines. This would create even higher levels of friction and many confrontations, leading to the Boston Massacre in 1770, where 5 were killed. This in and of itself was still not enough to spark revolution. What would spark the beginning of the grand crescendo that would lead the American colonies to the road to revolution was the Tea Act of 1773. The Tea Act was meant to solve 3 problems and provide a service to the colonies. 1. It was an attempt to keep the British East India Trading Company from going bankrupt. The collapse of such a big company would have largely negative effects on the British economy. Many in Parliament were heavily invested in the company personally as well. This would also provide an increased tax revenue with the tea sold. And the service to the colonies, they would enjoy cheaper tea even after the tax than the tea that was currently smuggled into the colonies. Why tea? Because the British East India Trading Company was sitting on a large surplus in their warehouses. The problem: Parliament would give the British East India Trading Company a total monopoly over the sale of tea in the colonies. The English thought the colonists would easily accept this, as it would reduce the price of tea. However, this would not go over so well in the colonies, as they were conditioned to expect the worst from these new acts. They saw this as the first step to carving up the trade and freedom of their markets. If the tea market could be cut out and given to the East India Trading Company, what would be next? Lumber? Iron? Tobacco? And here's where we take a step back in time, to 1694, a breaking in the normal taxation without representation narrative traditionally taught in schools, with the creation of the British National Bank, the Bank of England. It was created as a privately owned bank with its own stockholders. The creation of the bank was out of desperation. The government had just lost a crushing naval defeat to the French in 1690 and needed to rebuild its navy to remain a key player in the world stage. The British government was not known to be a fiscally sound institution, as the prior 100 years had shown, with monarchs like King Charles I who had simply taken money out of the mint where the merchants kept their silver and called it a loan. His predecessor, King Charles II, would default on an unrelated loan payment in 1676, creating an economic crisis in Britain. Many of these fiscal problems were likely to have been spawned from the fact that the king, an old institution of traditions, and the parliament, of new republican traditions, clashed constantly. The English government required £1.2 million to reconstruct their navy. However, their credit being so poor, they could not secure a loan. They turned to an alternate option for funding: the creation of the Bank of England. It was privately owned and not a legal part of Parliament or any other government body. The Bank of England was given the possession of the government's balances and was the only limited liability company granted the right to issue banknotes. It would raise the money for the loan as such. It would loan the government specie in return for government bonds. Then it would use the bonds as collateral to issue more banknotes that it could lend out to the government and wanting parties. This was one of the world's first fractional reserve banks, because the same coin of specie was being used to back multiple banknotes. In this manner, the English government was able to secure a loan for $1.2 million by giving up a part of their sovereignty to a private organization. The bank would grow in influence over the next century and would become more and more influential over Parliament's actions, and a very insidious cycle would begin to emerge. War would break out, and the Bank of England would facilitate the war effort through loans. The loans would grow ever larger, and this would push the government to raise taxes on the people to service the debts. Rinse, wash, repeat. Moving out of the 17th century and into the 18th century, England had been involved in external wars roughly every 11 years. However, in the 18th century, they would enter a major conflict, excluding small internal rebellions, every 4 years. This is a common trend among nations that adopt national banks, because every war is a banker's war. The effort it takes for a bank to make a small loan to an individual is the same as it takes to make a larger one to a country. Loaning to a country is indirectly loaning money to every citizen in the country. Through taxes, the liability of the debt is held and paid by everyone within the borders. The most profitable time to be a banker is during war. And when a large bank gains power within government, what other conclusion, other than war, could there be? Those that sought to shear away from the taxation of Britain were not merely for the cause of taxation without representation, to avoid the devastation that the escalating government debt required to be repaid by depleting its citizens of their liberties and wealth. Thomas Jefferson put it bluntly: If the American people ever allow a private bank to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around it will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent that their fathers conquered. The issuing of paper should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. I sincerely believe that this banking establishment is more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by the posterity under the name of funding it is but swindling futurity on a large scale. The colonies understood that if they did not get out from under the monetary control of the central bank and government burdened with its debt, they would be deprived of their wealth and prosperity that they enjoyed for so long, slowly losing their liberties to taxes and bankers. And now we return to the colonies, who have just received word that part of their economy has been carved up and served to the East India Trading Company. In 1773, 7 ships filled with tea left for the colonies. The ships that arrived in New York and Philadelphia were stopped by the Sons of Liberty and were not permitted to unload their cargo, and were forced back to Britain with the tea still on board. Ships that arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, were unloaded and the Sons of Liberty kept the tea under lock and key. However, in Boston, the governor put his foot down and was set on having the tea unloaded and sold as the law required. This was met with protests, and within a few days' time, the Boston Tea Party would take place. On December 13th, 1773, 120 men painted their faces and dressed as Indians stormed the ships, the Beaver, the Dartmouth, that were whalers, and the Eleanor, that was a full-rigged ship. 10,000 pounds sterling worth of tea was dumped in the harbor, about 1 million in today's money. Upon hearing the news, King George stated, "The die is now cast. The colonies must submit or triumph." In response, even those in Parliament that had previously voiced leniency with the colonies would be enraged. Intimidating tax collectors, protests, tar and featherings were tolerable, but the destruction of tea that was a much-needed link to tax revenue and the saving of the East India Trading Company from bankruptcy was too far. In response, the Parliament would pass the Intolerable Acts of 1774, known as the Coercive Acts in England. The act would shut down the Boston harbor until the 10,000 pounds were repaid. This would bring the Massachusetts economy to a standstill. Radical reorganization of the Massachusetts government, taking away the historic self-governments of the colony, allowing the governor to quarter soldiers in taverns and vacant houses, a move that signaled a future influx of troops to the region. The Sons of Liberty would capitalize this and organize the first Continental Congress in 1774. It would be organized to help against further threats of liberty of the colonies and establish a colonial-wide boycott of British goods. The Congress would encourage towns to create militias and stockpile arms. This would give birth to the historic Minutemen that would be ready to fight within a minute's notice. Join us in our next video where King George will declare the New England colonies in a state of rebellion. The first shots of the revolution will be fired as British redcoats make their way to destroy a stockpile of weapons and munitions near Boston that had been set up as a part of the Continental Congress's efforts. This has been Money Recall, and don't forget to like and subscribe.